In this series of demos, I want to cover some of the key concepts when it comes to data binding to entities. Our starting point for this demo is a window that's laid out like this. We're going to have a list of customers at the top in a drop-down combo box. We're going to have individual fields here for first name, last name, and email on the selected customer that are editable so we can see some of the change impacts there. We've got a data grid in the middle that's going to list out recent orders for that customer. And then we've got a data form down below where we can create a new order and add it to the collection up above. So those are the scenarios we want to support here, and we're going to do it by data binding to entities. The entities we're going to be working with are already defined in the solution here under this model folder. We've got a customer as a top-level object. You can see this is a plain old CLR object, just simple auto-implemented properties here for an ID, a first name, a last name, an email, a collection of orders as a list. And then notice you can also have computed properties here, ones that are read-only, and in this case computed from the first name and last name property, and those are data bindable as well. We've got an order object that has an ID, a parent customer ID, an order date, and a related object and order status ID that we'll set through a drop-down combo box, and then finally an items total. The order status object is just a simple lookup list kind of thing with an ID and a name. And then the way we're populating those entities for these demos is through a entity framework DB context, a code first DB context. And you can see we're just exposing DB sets for customers, orders, order statuses, and then we've got some model builder stuff down here. Again, I don't expect you to necessarily know how to do entity framework at all. To understand these demos, we're focusing on the data binding, not how we get those objects into memory. The code behind the main window currently is mostly empty. It's just got stubbed out event handlers for the drop-down list selection, the add and cancel buttons for adding orders. So the first thing we might need is to expose some data that we can data bind to. For this demo, I'm just going to put things as properties exposed from the main window itself. So we're not doing MVVM. We just want to expose objects from our code behind so that we can data bind to them. In simplest form, we could do that by just exposing normal auto-implemented properties on our window class here. So I've got a list of customers here that I can put into my combo box, and I've got a selected customer that I can use to drive those individual input fields for the selected customer. I'm going to need an instance of my DB context to go ahead and populate that data. And then I could go into my constructor here and go ahead and execute a query through my DB context to get back all the customers as a list and push those into my customers property that I declared down below. Then I could go to the customers combo that has an ID of that, set the selected item to the first customer in the list. And then if I set the data context of the window itself to a reference to the window, then any of the properties exposed by that window are now accessible on the data context for bindings to use. I need one other thing in the code behind here before we go to the XAML is in our customer combo box. When we make a selection, we need to set that selected customer property, which is defined right up above, to the customer that was selected. So we can go out to the customers combo, grab the selected item, cast it to a customer, and set that as our customer property. Later in the course we'll get to there's better ways to do this where you can do this through binding as well, but this will be sufficient for what we're showing now. Now we need to get things hooked up in the XAML. So I'm going to switch over to XAML. I'm going to go down to our combo box here. I'm going to add in some data binding property. First, we're going to set the item source to the customer's property exposed on our data context, which is the window instance itself. Each item in that collection is a whole customer object. We don't want it to toString that for us, so we'll set the display member path property to full name, that computed property on our entity, and we'll set the selected value path to the ID property. Then I'll go down to my data form here, and I'll add a binding for the first name property. We'll point that binding to the selected customer property that's on our data context, which is the window. And then we can dot down to the first name property on that selected customer to set the text there. Likewise for the last name and for the email. So with that code in place, we can fire this thing up and we can see our combo box is bound. Problem is, as we select things, we can see that the text boxes are not updating. To make matters worse, if I go and edit something like last name here, and tab out of the field, which is what causes it to get written, the last name jumps at that point to the actual value of the currently selected customer. But the first name and email are out of sync now. And if I go look at the list here and go back to Derek up here, his last name hasn't been modified there, but if I click on it, then the modification shows up. So things are wildly out of sync here because our entities are not properly defined to really support data binding. So in the next couple demos, we'll fix that by supporting change notifications when things are changing.